It's probably always a good idea to say, hey, am I delegating too much? You kind of should have your fingers in all of this stuff.
How did you go from managing a 20-person team to like a cross-functional 80-person organization?
You can understand kind of what questions you might want to ask. I think the other thing that's helpful is...
Would you be somebody if thrown into something and there's like a fire hose of information coming your way?
Yeah, that's my wheelhouse. As I said, just give me the stuff. Get yourself in that acceptance mode that you're just going to hear a lot of things. They're not going to make sense, but you're going to keep listening, and the fourth time you hear it...
Manlio Lo Conte is an advisor, investor, and coach. He was the chief product officer at Zwift, world's #1 indoor cycling app. He even worked at Amazon as senior product manager.
You know, it's useful to look at your own processes, right? What is it that you're doing, maybe not even for customers, maybe just for yourself?
I'd heard a podcast interview with Perplexity's CEO, and there's something about this whole language models. It was like, if I have my mom talk to it, and sometimes you might say it in a totally different way that is not normal English, and can your language model still catch that? We want them to adapt to us and not the other way around. Just looking to the future, what trends or opportunities are you most excited about shaping the future of the tech industry? Hello, welcome to the Priyanka Shinde Podcast, where we dive into the art and science of strategy, execution, and leadership. I'm your host, Priyanka Shinde, author of The Art of Strategic Execution and a consultant for tech leaders. In this podcast, I bring you candid conversations with top executives, startup founders, and industry experts who are driving innovation, delivering results, and staying ahead in today's competitive landscape. We will break down what it takes to tap into founder mode and turn vision into action. If you are serious about elevating your leadership and execution skills, make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or YouTube. It helps the podcast and ensures you never miss an episode. To the Priyanka Shinde Podcast. Today I have a very special guest and somebody I've worked with closely, Manlio Lo Conte. Manlio has worked in tech for over 25 years as a designer, developer, and a product leader. He built games, AI applications, and hardware products, and led teams at both startups and large tech companies. He currently works as a product consultant and advisor. He lives in Seattle and spends his free time playing games and writing music. Welcome to the show, Manlio.
Hi, Priyanka. It's great to see you. Thanks so much for having me. Wonderful to get to have this chat with you, and obviously to just generally talk with you because, we worked together at Meta for a couple of years, and I always really enjoyed sort of our collaboration and conversations.
Yeah, same here. It was a great time, and we worked on some pretty amazing stuff through amazing couple of years. So I'm really excited for our conversation as well, and I would love to just kick things off where ask you, tell us a little bit more about yourself and what you do currently.
Yeah. So what I do currently is really interesting, to me at least, because it was not. I'm trying something different. I've been trying something different for the last year or so. So basically since the time I started in working, I've always had just one gig, and when my last job ended, I really had a lot of trouble getting my head around the idea of finding another sort of all-encompassing full-time job. And so, rather than sort of jump into the first thing or the second thing or the third thing that kind of came along, I decided to take a little time and, really search for something that felt kind of, quote, perfect. And then the more I was not working, the more I sort of noticed these other, I would call it spare brain capacity opening up in ways that it hadn't for, decades, right? I didn't have some sort of background thought process trying to solve a problem at all hours of night or keeping me awake. And so I've sort of just kept going with that. And I've been trying a bunch of different things. And so I did a little coaching, both sort of individually and then through a program that helped product managers find jobs. I've been doing a little consulting, both a few companies that I, happen to be fortunate enough to be an investor in, and then, some other, a couple folks that I've sort of found through various connections. And I'm just trying to see what feels right. And then I'm spending a lot more time with my family. I have an 11-year-old. We homeschool him, and so there are many opportunities to like dig in and get engaged in more of an active way than I was when I was working full time. And then I'm also, I've been a lifelong musician. I would not say I've ever been super good at spending that much time on it. So I'm just trying to spend more time and see if it really is just a hobby or if it's something that I want to. I don't know about professional. I don't think I'll ever quite be there, but like I want to see if it's a hobby that continues to scale enjoyment as I put more hours into it.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it sounds amazing. I mean, feels like you're getting like really getting into spending more time on things that are more meaningful to you at this stage. And it almost reminds me of like, I had a similar thought process when I went from my last job to doing something on my own. I think what you said really resonated because I had the same feeling like, do I just do the same thing? Do I do a variation of the same thing? And this thing you mentioned about having spare brain power almost, which you never get when you're working because you're constantly thinking. And I think it had that same feeling. So that really, yeah, it kind of just had a deja vu there. And I was thinking back to my time. So, um, so I'm sure your day doesn't like your day isn't a typical day that somebody who's working might have. And so maybe the question here would be like, how did you then go from adjusting to having more like similar or typical days in a corporate job to today?
It's been really hard, and I haven't really figured it out entirely. What I sort of started with total unstructured time. Um, that was not great because it turned out that like I didn't really know how to make use of my unstructured time, and so I would have entire days where I would sort of look up and it would be 4 o'clock, and I would say, well, I didn't really get much done today. And so then I tried the opposite, and I tried like quote PMing my schedule, right? And so I would put these like blocks in for the things I wanted to do. And it's funny, my Augustus, my 11-year-old, would make fun of me because we all share our calendars, and so like this calendar invite would pop up for like practicing drums, and Augustus would make fun of me because I just wouldn't do it. You know what I mean? The calendar invite would pop up, and then I would just like not do it. And he was like, and he would just be like, "You're so silly," right? He's like, "Oh, I guess it's time for drums. Oh, wait, no, you don't do what the calendar says." So he thought that was cool. Um, what I actually found was that it helped to have some big chunks of things that would necessitate scarcity in the calendar, right? And so after a couple months of sort of I'll call it decompressing, but one could also, I think, accurately describe it as like listlessly wandering around the house. My wife Kristen came to me and she said, "Hey, if you're not doing anything, like you could take Augustus to school a couple days a week, and for us that means not just take him, but sort of be there with him all day. That's part of the deal with his local homeschool school in Seattle." And so I said, "Yeah, sure," and I kind of signed up for. She and I looked at the schedule. We found a couple days, and so 2 days a week, I'm the the Augustus parent, and that actually was really helpful because it meant that everything I wanted to get done had to either be achievable during that time when I was at school, and there were obviously some things that you can do and some things you can't as you're sitting in the kind of school hallway. But it also meant that the days where I wasn't the Augustus parent became a lot easier to schedule, right? Because then all of a sudden, hey, I want to take a voice lesson or I want to take a drum lesson, which are both things I'm doing. All of a sudden those can't happen any day. They have to happen on the days I'm not with my kid, with Augustus, and that makes it a little easier to kind of have a starting part for what like a schedule looks like. And so my day to day now, my weekly schedule now basically is, I have a full time freelance client right now, and so I a Monday and Tuesday, I do a bunch of that work. And then as Wednesday and Thursday, when I'm with Augustus at his school, um, that gives me some time for like work as well. And then Friday is kind of a split day between a little bit of work and a little bit of Augustus. And then I sort of slot in music into the afternoons on Monday and Tuesday. So I have like a break from just like doing the work all day.
Mhm.
Um, and then on Friday, I kind of mix that in a little bit with a longer period of time where I sit and say, oh, I'm actually going to really sit here and practice for a while.
Yeah. Wow. You almost are like, there's this big chunks that are in your schedule, but then in between, it seems like there is a little bit more flexibility. So, in a way, I kind of felt that it's almost like being more productive and like a couple of days are taken away for something else.
Yeah, that's right. The other thing that was a real unlock for me was I was really hung up on the idea that in the granular amount of time that I needed to get anything done was an hour, right? I was like, oh, I need an hour to like do this thing. And so if I looked at the clock and it was 1 and I had to leave for something else at 2, or let's say it was 1:15, oftentimes I couldn't get anything in there, right? Like, and it wasn't because the things themselves did actually took 45 minutes, right? What I found when I actually timed myself playing drums or practicing is that I was only practicing for 15 or 20 minutes. Like that was my entire practice routine, at which point I was ready to stand up on most days. And so I had to just kind of not necessarily trick myself, but be really diligent about saying, hey, you do have time to run upstairs and go do this before you leave. And in fact, you probably have extra time because you've got 45 minutes and that this is not an hour exercise you're talking about. This really is a
Mm.
like 15-minute exercise. And so I've gotten better about just being honest with myself on how long things really take.
Mhm.
And then some opposite ones, obviously, and this is a passion you and I share, which is fitness. And like I found myself constantly underestimating how much time I would need for exercise, right? And so I would say, oh yeah, I can do a workout in 45 minutes. And that was just never true, right? By the time I would get downstairs, get changed, figure out what I was going to do, turn the machines on and start going, I'd already blown past 10 minutes, and then you warm up and then you look up and it's like I'm doing a 25-minute workout and then I have to cool down. And so I learned that I couldn't that there were not everything could be sort of slammed into those little mini spots. I needed
Mhm.
to find some things that I really did allow myself to take as much time as the activity took.
Yeah. Wow. I feel like there's a lesson there even for people who are at their jobs. And we have these constant meetings. We hear about meetings all the time. And then you have like maybe 30 minutes or 45 minutes to the next meeting. And I think it might feel a little bit similar where I only have 30, 45, and I need to maybe put this report or something, and we don't have time, but technically you do. I mean, you could push something out in that time, at least get half the way there. So I feel like there's an important lesson there.
Yeah, that's right. And like the I think a lot of the literature, I don't know, that pretends I've read something which I haven't, but right, there's a lot of stuff where it's like, well, you can't get into flow state in that amount of time, and so you can't get any deep work done. And I don't know about you, but like deep work did not account for a large percentage of what I was doing by the end, right? Like there was certainly some of it, and it was productive, but there was also a bunch of things I had to do every day, which were legitimately 5-minute tasks or 10-minute tasks. And it was like, hey, you have to reply to this email, you have to like look at this thing that person sent you and give them a quick note, right? Like you have to um, do expense reports or admin stuff, and all that stuff was not deep work. I also even when I was working full time, working from home, and I still am working full time, but when I was on a more rigid schedule and beholden to other people's schedules, what I found was that I could, um, if I really needed to get something in the middle of the day, whether or not it was sort of practicing music or swimming or like exercise, uh, the most critical time to get it done was the first 5 minutes after my last thing ended, right? Because if I let myself sit there, check email, check messenger, check work chat, I would get sucked into something. But if as soon as my last meeting ended, I got up and just like headed for the pool or headed for the drum set, then it was much easier to get it in and then kind of like come on back and be ready for my next thing.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Yeah. I mean, yeah. So you don't let it too much thinking happen between those 5 minutes and just like move on to the
That's right.
next thing.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, I think that's great. And I mean, I sometimes kind of fall into the same traps. So I'm going to try that one out as well. Um, Switching gears a little bit, you have worked in a variety of different teams across like large tech companies and startups. What did you find were like the differences and similarities in these teams in at startups or at large tech companies?
Uh, yeah, that's interesting. So the one of the things that I would say was really different, it depended on the company, right? But like, uh, there, uh, there was often a real disparity in agreement on how work was done, right? And so you and I would probably call it process, right? What my most starkly, when I went from Amazon, which for good reasons, I would describe as having not necessarily a heavy process culture, but like at least a fairly consistent way of doing business. And I came to Meta, and I started working with you, right? We were working together on Assistant. I remember really early on, I think going to you or and just being like, I don't understand what's happening here. Like this feels like chaos, right? Like it's not clear how anything's getting done. It's not clear sort of what the rituals are. It just feels like everything is super organic in the way it's getting created. And I think part of that was like the state we were with the team, right? It was a really early team. It wasn't clear how long it was going to be around. We had no products live, right? And so it was almost a startup-y-ish figuring out what rituals worked and what didn't. That experience ended up being super useful when I then went to Zwift, where I was the chief product officer, because it was another organization that, had some rituals, had some process, wasn't clear a lot of times why the process existed. And so, I would walk into meetings and observe and sort of leave and say, well, I'm not really sure what we got out of that. Right. And I would ask sort of other people, hey, does this seem like something that's working? And they say, oh, no. It's something we started 2 years ago because the leader at the time liked it, but the audience has changed and the process has changed. And we just keep doing it, because it gets us all together. And so over the course of a year, we sort of went through and curated and figured out what processes worked and what didn't, which I think is actually, part of what gets missed sometimes at big companies, right? It's like it was not always the energy to examine the processes once they'd been put in place and say, hey, are these still working for us? Are they the right things? Are they not the right things? Sometimes we did, right? Like sometimes at the end of the half, you'd look and you say, hey, is this still working? Is this something we have to do? But sometimes you would find yourself kind of continuously doing the thing that was just not providing value anymore, but you couldn't stop doing it because no one could take the time and effort to like figure out how to make it better, right? And it takes real time, right? It takes actual brain power to sit in there and say, let's inspect and let's figure out what parts of this are working and what aren't. And we have to go do stakeholder interviews and we have to ask questions that maybe we haven't asked in a long time. Like, is this providing you value? Right? Is this artifact or this thing we're doing useful? And if it's not, like maybe we should stop doing it. My I don't know if it's favorite, but at one thing at Zwift when I was scaling up to managing a much larger team is I had these sort of like I had this like extended staff meeting, right? And in my head, it was a meeting where it was my directs and then the senior members of their team. So a reasonably large group, 15, 20 people. And it was supposed to be, a place where we sort of shared information and collaborated and had kind of this like group, almost like team of purported experts in the company to help think through big problems. But that's never what it was, right? And I don't know if I set the agenda wrong or I didn't ask for enough help, but it usually just ended up being 45 minutes of me talking, right? And like various people on my staff sometimes engaging, but a lot of it was just me talking. And so after a couple months, I sort of said, hey, I'm going to cancel this because I don't always feel like it's a good use of time. But I said I won't hold you to account now. But if any of you feel like this is missing, right? If after not having it for a couple weeks, you guys feel like there's something missing, like reach out and we'll kind of find another mechanism. And no one reached out, right? So like clearly that was an example of something that was not useful for anyone in the room, myself included. But it took me, I don't know if earlier in my career I'd have had the self, what's the right word? Sort of self-criticism or self-reflection to be able to say, I'm going to cancel this meeting that in my head I think should be useful, but like practically speaking isn't working.
Yeah, I think it takes, I mean, in some ways it does take, I think, like that self-reflection, or maybe it's self-criticism, or if it's just awareness that whatever was working may not be working anymore, or just because the way things were, they may not always provide that same value. And I was reminded of, I think, I don't remember when exactly, but I think there was some meeting where Fiji was there. She was the head on the Facebook side of things. And she had mentioned something similar, which is every quarter or something, she would do a audit of all her meetings and then like just pull meetings off the calendar because they were no longer useful or needed, which we, I think, just forget in the day to day of work. So I think we're getting a lot of productivity hacks out of you today. um, but I think that brings me to this question, which is, when going from like Amazon to Meta to Zwift, like you have gone into different domains. You have changed domains from gaming to AI, back to a little bit of gaming. And so, as a product manager, how did you manage those transitions? Oh, because usually we hear that product managers, they need a lot of like deep domain knowledge in order to really be great product managers. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So it's interesting because in all of those jobs, when I was trying to get them, right, when I was applying for them and trying to get them, I had almost the exact same conversation at one point, not through the whole thing, but at one point I would say, either I would say or someone would say to me, and in the case of Meta, it was Heidi, right? Heidi and I sat down for my interview when I was coming to join Meta to join Assistant, and Heidi basically said, I don't know what to make of you because you don't know anything about this space. And so like I'm trying to figure out if you're like generally intelligent enough to be useful or if you're just going to like come in and kind of waste everyone's time. And Amazon was a different way. Amazon said to me exactly the opposite, which was, you seem smart. Why don't you come do this thing? We know it's going to be hard. You know what I mean? I don't know. I think the honest truth is the way I did it was I just like was terrible at the job for 6 months. And I was very fortunate in almost every case to have, maybe not Zwift. I think Zwift is probably the exception, but certainly Amazon and Meta and Zynga. I was very fortunate enough to have managers and leaders who were willing to give me enough space to learn. As long as I was continually showing progress, right? Like my first half at Meta was very hard, and I don't know that anything productive happened, right? Like it wasn't entirely clear what my role should have been. I was having trouble figuring out what impact meant. Amazon was even similar, right? My first 6 months were very hard. In fact, I saw my initial boss from Amazon recently. He and I talked about a year ago. He lived in Seattle, and he said to me something I had never known. He said, we thought about firing you. He said, after 3 months, we really thought about firing you because like you didn't seem to know top from bottom. And I was very lucky that, just as they were, because it's a big company, so it takes a while to make those things happen. And, just as that was happening, I seemed to be figuring it out. And that kind of bought me enough credit to kind of continue to sort of show progress. But like what I was doing during that whole time, it was just like listening and trying to absorb as much as possible, and then adjusting my judgment on how quickly I was you know trying to actively drive something versus just like be in observation mode, be in listen mode. And I would say between those two cultures, Meta is much more, I would say, forgiving of that, right? The whole boot camp process, you're going to come in for 6 weeks, just listen, have your first conversations, get to know people, focus on relationships. I would say Meta is much more open to that process. At Amazon, the expectation was you would come in and be driving from day one, right? And so when, there was not as much time or liberty to sort of like ramp up and figure things out, I just sort of I got lucky that I happened to have a few built-in resets in the program. And so, I literally got a chance to do the same program kickoff 3 times with different groups of engineers. And the third time I actually did a really, I was actually figured it out, right? The first and second time it had not gone particularly well. And so nothing helps like repetition, right? Like, eventually you kind of figure it out. And I guess the other thing that has helped me as a PM is, I enjoy listening and talking to people and asking questions. And that sounds really basic, but like, I really do like the feeling of just having massive amounts of information thrown at me and be kind of like blindly swimming through it. And so if you can sort of, get yourself in that acceptance mode that you're just going to hear a lot of things, they're not going to make sense, but you're going to keep listening. And the 4th time you hear it, maybe you'll kind of like draw the right connection. Then eventually you can start to kind of understand how the system works.
Mm. So would you be somebody like if you're like thrown into something and there's like a fire hose of information coming your way, you would be like totally like in your comfortable with that?
Yeah, that's my wheelhouse, right? So it's funny, and I don't. We can edit this out later if you want, but like the person who I actually think got onboarded to Assistant the way I would have wanted was Purnima, right? Like because Purnima got put right in the middle of everything with you and told, hey, crisis project, you're going to have to be here all the time. We're going to come to you with every question and you're going to figure it out. That would have worked really well for me, as opposed to sort of me being given a weird, ambiguous thing off to the side and told, hey, we don't know what this is. See what you can make of it, right? Like that is actually not the way I like to join. And so on Zwift, what happened was, I knew that, right? And that's sort of what I told the CEO going in, as I said, just give me the stuff. And then, it helped that within 30 days of joining the company, I had to go to the board and present our operating plan for the year, right? And that's a pretty good built-in deadline for like, well, you're going to have to get up in front of these people and own all of this stuff. So you better figure out, how it all works. That process was immensely helpful for me kind of ramping up and getting my feet underneath me.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, one is, I think you talk about a deadline, but just like having a little bit of pressure, I think increases your performance. That's kind of the general way I've seen with a lot of people. And I've heard a lot of people say that as well.
Yeah.
So I think, there is something about like, let me just like try and figure out, as long as I know here's what I need to do, I guess it makes it better. Which then brings me to this, like there are a lot of other product managers out there who say may not have a very forgiving first 6 months or something like that. And they are in this situation where either they are changing domains or getting a fire hose of information. Knowing what you know now, like what are the 1 or 2 things you would say they should be aware of?
So I will give credit where credit is due. This is a piece of advice I did not take when I joined Meta. It was a piece of advice given to me by the lead technical architect on Assistant. You remember Jinsong, right? And so when I met with Jinsong, he said to me, hey, the first thing you need to do is you need to find the smallest thing you can and ship it end to end. And you need to go through the entire process, design, definition, working with the engineering team, release, get it out the door, iteration. He's like, it's really important you do that as quickly as possible, because that will teach you at least how all the mechanics work around this sort of organizational monster that you've joined. And I didn't do that, right? I was just like, okay, well, I don't know how I would possibly do that. And I couldn't really make sense of it. And so I sort of focused on other things, but he was right. And it's, the other thing that is really useful, that I did a little more of, this came from a guy named Oren Hod, who was at Meta with us and then is now at Unity. And I'd ironically worked with him at Amazon. It's funny, I worked with Oren at Amazon on the same team. We weren't, and then he was at Meta when I was there, and now he's at Unity. And he said, look, just look around. You're the PM. Look around for the thing that's not getting done and volunteer to do that. And he said at Meta, it's usually no one's taking notes in the meetings, right? Which I thought was really funny and totally true, right? Because I would be going to all these meetings and no one would seem to be writing down anything. And someone would make we'd reach this weird agreement and then leave. And it was a really good one. And so the essence of that is like, find the way you can be adding value immediately, even if you're not doing the thing it is you think you've been hired to do or you think you want to be doing, right? And so, if you see something and it needs doing, it doesn't matter what it is, like raise your hand and say, hey, I'll go do that thing if it gets me into the organism and gets me working and gets me like connected with people. That actual example is actually my advice for how to get promoted. Oddly enough, right? It is like, when I really started getting a ton of traction on in all of my jobs, usually it started by me taking on some responsibility that, like, objectively, I think you could have said was outside the realm of what my job description, previous work history, like anything. It was like, this is not something you should be doing, but it needed to be done. And it seemed pretty big and pretty messy, and it looked like an opportunity to like get really entrenched in some big piece of work that was going to be far-reaching. That even if it had nothing to do with the act of product management, that always paid off like huge dividends for me.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that whole thing that says nothing at this company is somebody else's problem.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like that. And I say this in the book as well, is like, solve problems that no one else wants to, if you want to build your credibility, if you want to get promoted, if you want to establish yourself. I think that's a really great advice. And it goes for everybody, not just product managers. Every person who's working, who's trying to make a mark for themselves, wherever they may be, solving. And then I think there's another thing is, you just learn so much in the process of solving that problem. So yeah, highly recommend.
Yeah, and then to add that, the next move, right, is that you dive in, you learn how to do the thing, and then you teach the next person how to do it, so you don't have to keep doing it yourself, right? Like, that's really where the value comes, is like, you've made it a repeatable process that you can then hand to the next person and say, okay, now you do this, right? Now you run the planning process. Now you write the weekly updates, right? And and then you as an individual kind of wipe your hands of it and go find the next thing that's hard and ambiguous that someone needs to do that no one seems to want to go near.
Yeah, that's great. And like, that brings me to this, that you were talking about Zwift and like doing things there, and it was like a change for you as well, going from Meta to Zwift. How did you go from managing a 20-person team to like a cross-functional 80-person organization at Zwift?
Yeah. So the hardest part about it was at 20 people, you can't really know everything that's going on, but you at least have like a sense of it. I think at 80 people, you just have, you have no hope. There's entire pockets of the team where you're not going to happen upon them, right? And so the first thing that I did moderately successfully is I tried to meet with I went and I said, I'm going to meet with everyone at least once, right? As I'm joining, I'm going to go find all 80 people on this team and sit down with them and just like ask them about themselves and kind of learn what they do. And then, mostly what I tried to do was pick the areas that I wasn't going to know a lot about naturally, right? And for me, that was the teams that like I wasn't used to managing, which included like sort of I was managing a game art, a 3D art team. I was managing a content team. I was managing certainly design and PM and research, but I knew a little bit more about those areas, right? And so I felt a little bit more natural sort of helping and supporting those functions. But I spent a lot more time with the functions and the leaders in those functions that I didn't know a lot about, right? Because I wanted to understand like what exactly is your job? Like what are we doing on this team? And that was really helpful just to get a better sense of like how all the different pieces worked together and interacted with each other. I also for a while like audited the meetings that my directs would have, not because I wanted to see if they were spending their time well, but like I wanted to understand the next layer down what they were hearing and what inputs were coming to them all the time to make sure that I was sort of getting those right things, right? Getting those same inputs. The the my temptation that I did not follow was just like kind of, hey, you manage 80 people, but I only had 4 directs, and so I would or 5 directs, so I'd sit back and just only process what came to me from them. And that at least initially I knew wasn't going to be enough. That I wanted to go a little deeper and just like understand what the working rhythms were elsewhere on the team.
Mhm. Mhm. In those terms, like how did that then translate into, say, launching products at scale and multiple things, or multiple avenues of launches that you would have to go through at Zwift, especially like when you're building hardware and software products combined.
Well, yeah. So the useful thing was, you know, by going through that process, I at least started to get a better sense of who all the people were in the room, right? Which is one of the trickiest parts of these big multi-pronged hardware and software products is, you as you know, we sit in these rooms of like 40 people and everyone's got their little chunk that they like, pop up and say. And over time, you have to figure out as a leader, like, what the right questions are. That's kind of your entire job, right? Your entire job is like, hey, what questions should I be asking? And so by, going a little deeper in the org and understanding what people's jobs are, you can understand kind of what questions you might want to ask so you don't like totally freak out, someone with a question that isn't intended for them. I think the other thing that's helpful is, and I would say this to my team, I would just say, look, if you've got things you want me to say out loud publicly in this room that you're having trouble getting through, use me as a puppet, right? So it's like,
Mm.
what are the questions? What are the things that you would like to say, that may be a disagreement with someone else, but you just don't feel comfortable kind of saying it yourself? Um, and in some cases, that's kind of what you're there for, right? Like you're not necessarily you're there to inspect, but you are also there to be kind of a safe mouthpiece for your team who maybe don't feel like they can get their issues heard in the right forums.
Got it. Got it. Yeah. I mean, I think I'm sure your teams would appreciate that a lot, because especially when you give them sort of that air cover and say, here, I'm here if you need me for XYZ, in order to say, not necessarily like for them to fail, but for them maybe to take risk in doing something that might have a chance of like failure, but giving them that protection, which I feel is very much needed, especially if you're in an innovative environment where you don't know everything that can go wrong with all these new types of products that we are building. So that brings me to this, like, at Zwift, there were a lot of initiatives you led around growth, around improving retention rates. I'm sure people would love to know, like, how do you think of like the right strategies and the right features that will have the most impact in delivering these kind of results, and how do you prioritize them as a product leader?
Yeah, I think the most valuable thing that I did to understand that problem at Zwift was actually before I started the company. Or sorry, before I joined the company. And it had nothing to do with uh, sort of frameworks or whatever. It was, I just, like, as a brand new user, went through the setup process myself and forced myself to, like, write down in real time everything I was feeling and doing as I was doing it. And I actually think it was really important for me to do this not not knowing as much about the product, because that sense of, like, fresh eyes, right? There are so many things that we just get used to them in our products, right? And we know sort of in our head that they are not the best part of the experience, but it's really hard to fix them for whatever reason, and you get used to them. And then over time, as you get fluent with your own software, you just kind of click through them and you're like, oh yeah, this is no problem, this. So, like, one example at Zwift was, we had this onboarding ride, right? Like, your first ride in the game, you would have all this kind of it was supposed to be your introduction to the a bunch of cycling terms, then also how the app worked, and it was really advanced, right? Like, it was, even if you were a really good cyclist, like, things came at you fast and they were really intense. And so I went through it and I said, wow, like, this is way too overwhelming for most new users.
Mhm.
And then we eventually kind of pared it back and said, okay, well, maybe this isn't the right first introduction to kind of give to people. um, the other thing that I think is, and so that was sort of one set. I don't know that I would have uh, thought about doing that had I not been through it as a customer and found it so daunting. I would say the other thing is, like, as a product person, you often want to solve your problems with features, and a lot of times the problem has nothing to do with the feature. It's that, just, like, there's either too much, or the feature's too slow, or the entire thing is too wonky, or there's some sort of, like, missing help screen. uh, and again, when we looked at uh, setup for Zwift, and this was not one I can take credit for. This was one that the team really dug into. Is they said, hey, like, we just can't be clear enough on what the customer has to do next, right? Like, we just have to be absolutely step by step by step by step, super clear about uh, what the person needs to go in order to get set up. Because they would see, again, in research, time and time again, people would sort of get in, start the process, immediately get lost, and then that was it, right? Like, you're sort of in the Wild West. And that rang very true for me from almost every piece of user research I had done with every hardware product, right? Like, all the way back to when I was doing home monitoring cameras for Amazon. We were auditing another company's setup process, which I thought was really good. I actually thought their setup process was great. And I found I was with a customer who didn't know his own Wi-Fi password, which, as technologists, blows our mind. Or it's, what do you mean you don't know your own Wi-Fi password? And I remember he took out this, like, paper book to look for his Wi-Fi password, put it in. He got it wrong, right? He typed it in wrong, and the error messaging, instead of suggesting that perhaps he had gotten his password wrong, took him to some weird screen that basically said, oh, we can't connect to the network. Maybe you should try this other thing. And I remember the guy saying, well, maybe this just doesn't work with my network. But I knew, because I was sitting there watching him, not allowed to say anything. I was like, no, no, I know what's wrong. What's wrong is that I watched you just, like, have to kind of translate your password onto a computer, which is clearly something you don't do very much. And there's a reasonable chance you just need to kind of try it again. But not everyone thinks that way, right? Not everyone thinks, oh, I just need to enter my password, 2 or 3
Yeah.
times until I get the right one. So it's not often. Sometimes it's not a new thing, right? Sometimes it's either, like, taking a thing away, or taking an existing thing that's always felt a little bit rough, and just, like, really, really polishing it to make sure that every weird edge case, has kind of a safe path for the customer.
Yeah. It's reminding me of, like, when you do these sessions with customers and you watch them play with the thing. Like, I think that's kind of, when you said fresh eyes, I feel like that's your fresh eyes, because if you have been working in a product for say 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, now you're developing expertise in it, but you're also losing that freshness or that fresh perspective. And so really going in and having that customer session and observing them, it's great. I mean, even like I did that early when I just joined Meta, we would do that for our ads products. And it was very interesting to just watch people play with this and then sit and like wait for it to load or something like that. And there's that whole notion of like customer empathy that you build when you watch them use your products. So I'm sure like for product managers, that's really something important that I'm sure you would stress on as well.
Customer sessions, and I highly recommend when you get new team members, or new partners, or anyone new to your product for the first time, just like listen to what they say and listen to their feedback and sort of assume that they're probably right. You know what I mean? I remember an assistant partner who I had an early meeting with, and they basically said, "Yeah, as far as I can tell, your WhatsApp calling thing doesn't work." And I was very sort of taken aback because we had like just spent a bunch of time on it, and I was like, "Well, what do you mean?" And they said, "Well, I've tried it like 2 or 3 times to call my parents, and it doesn't work. Doesn't recognize my voice. Doesn't recognize this. Doesn't recognize that." And of course they were right, right? Of course there was something about the names that they were doing and the way in which we were doing it that wasn't working for the way they wanted to do it. So even though we thought it worked, right? We had gone through our kind of golden cases. It wasn't reflective of what actual people were going to use it.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you still use your portal?
No, I had to give all my portals away when I left Meta. It turned out I did not own any that I was allowed to keep, and so I returned them all to the company. Um, and
Yeah.
yeah, and honestly, the person that we really used Portal with a lot was my dad back in Massachusetts, and he finally was like, "I don't know how to use this thing anymore," and it was too hard for him. And so, he and I kind of regressed to phone calls and kind of got off video calls.
Yeah. Yeah. I just kind of thought of that because we use it a lot, and like WhatsApp calling isn't something that's available on any other device
Yeah.
outside of Portal. And we had bought like those Portal Goes, the
Hmm.
what do you say? um, Portable ones. And we bought one to give it to our parents in India as well. So we use it a lot, but now it's kind of like end of life, getting, almost dying. So uh, just thought of that as you were talking about WhatsApp calling. Um, One thing I wanted to kind of touch with you, I think, as we talk about assistant a lot and AI, something that we had both worked on back in the day. I mean, since what, 2022, we have had this whole hype around generative AI.
Hmm.
So I know you and I had a brief conversation then, but like just hearing everything about like with ChatGPT coming out, what was your reaction as someone who had worked closely building AI products?
I mean, honestly, I felt like I felt like clearly I had been doing something wrong. If the previous 4 years we had, you know, repeatedly tried and failed to come up with what felt like a uh, strong product market fit with the things we were building, and and then immediately kind of saw how the same interaction patterns and the same, maybe not the same technologies, but the same sort of like a branch of the technologies could be so sort of widely adopted and picked up, right? Like I remember talking to one of the other PMs on the project. We had both left Meta at that point, 3 or 4 months after we had left, and just saying, what idiots are we that we like somehow could not find well retained use cases for these things, only to have someone else come along and very clearly show that it wasn't a customer needs problem, right? There was clearly a customer need that you could see in sort of the widespread adoption. It was like the way we were doing it, you know what I mean? And the way that we were trying to kind of implement it. So I was really like, to some degree, disheartened by all the time I had spent essentially building sort of the last horse right? To use that like Henry Ford metaphor, right? As I feel like we built literally the final horse before cars. But also as a user, I continue to be super excited, right? I use the tools a bunch in the consulting work that I do, just for all sorts of weird things that used to take me a lot of time and now don't. You know what I mean? Like, it used to take me so much time to come up with, filler text for mock-ups, or like, different sort of user stories or examples, or like, placeholder images, right? All that kind of stuff. And now it's actually just really easy to sort of shoot off an ask and say, hey, I kind of want like a few things that look like this now. And it's never what I would call like 95% quality, like you'd get from a designer, right? But like,
Right.
for what I'm doing, it's good enough, right? It's 75%, and it helps me know real fast if I've even got a scratch of something useful there, right? Or if, I'm just totally kind of barking down the wrong path.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it definitely like gets you further along faster than you would without it. And it is so interesting, like how it became like so widely adopted by everybody. And sometimes, when we talk about AI, technically it has been around for 50 plus years, like since the 60s or something, there has been some form of AI. And we may have discovered it in the 2000s or whatever. Uh, but it's just like so much like now even the kids can use it as well. Um, as a product leader and somebody who's like consulting with companies as well, what advice do you give other product leaders who are trying to integrate generative AI into their products? And especially when it comes to balancing like that innovation and the ethical considerations of Gen AI.
Well, I mean, I guess one thing that it's like any tool or technology is like people can sort of tell when you're trying to staple it on to a place where it doesn't fit, right? And the best sort of comparison that's relevant to my career is there was a long time after Zynga where everyone wanted to talk to me about how to gamify their like app, right? Ever like game loops was a big deal, and so I actually did a stint for a year for a startup that was trying to use gamification principles to sell like ancillary insurance products. Um, and it's not like that was without merit. There were definitely some good things in there, but like, you it doesn't the existence of the tool shouldn't sort of change the process you go through to figure out what the customer need is, right? And so like, you can't just go use Gen AI in your product to use Gen AI in your product. I mean, maybe you can, right? Like maybe you have something where there's a real need for it, but
Mhm.
it helps to go like, talk to customers and figure out what their needs are and say like, okay, like you need to, as a PM, you need to understand the capabilities, right? Because you need to like craft those stories and craft those prompts and sort of think about how people might use the tool. And I think the other thing that's useful is, it's useful to look at your own processes, right? So like, what is it that you're doing, maybe not even for customers, maybe just for yourself, where it feels repetitive, and you can kind of like, um, you can either automate it or you can use it to kind of like flex in a different way. I will give you one example from Zwift is, Zwift runs on content. A lot of the content are workouts, like these guided workouts.
Mhm.
And we never even put, I'm not sure if they put this into production yet, but my directs and I were having dinner one night, and we started using ChatGPT to like come up with different workouts just to like see what they would do. And it could do it, right? And then we started asking it to come up with workouts that could be sort of spoken in tone of celebrities, which was just sort of a silly thing. I think one of us said, someone was just like, "Oh, make it talk like Ryan Reynolds," you know what I mean? And it actually did a really good job, right? Now, like, I don't know that customers want Ryan Reynolds telling them how to bike. I mean, maybe they do, maybe they don't. But like, that was an interesting example of like an emergent capability that kind of made everyone's viewpoint on it change a little bit, and then was like, okay, well, what could we go use this for, right? Like, maybe certainly Ryan Reynolds is not the right answer, but there's probably a dozen different combinations of a thing that the model knows how to do, and a flex that like we've just never thought about as content creators or content designers within the company, that could be kind of interesting. But
Mhm.
you know, I think it's I tell, like with anything when I'm giving a PM advice, it's just like, yes, like explore the space, right? And get a good sense of it and play with it. But don't assume that the answer is just going to be like, you know, throwing the GPT chat window into your app, and then and then kind of magic will happen after that.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, there's so much happening there. I mean, you could use Gen AI for like some basic stuff or, just like productivity stuff and things like that. And then there's like, does it actually move the product forward or like increase the user engagement or do something different in terms of like whatever is the intention of the product? So there also seem to be a lot of like misconceptions around Gen AI. So is there something in particular, like a biggest misconception that you feel anybody in product development or user experience should be mindful of?
Well, I guess the thing I would suggest, or at least ask people to pressure check a little bit, it goes back to our thing, which is we worked on Assistant for so long, and how many people did we see who we would get in front of the thing and then they would literally not know what to ask? You know what I mean? Like, we just sort of assumed everyone would kind of get in front of this interface and have this like pre-selected list of questions and queries and things they wanted to do with it, and usually they didn't, right? And you can see ChatGPT and a bunch of the sort of like built-on agents getting better at like suggested prompts, like maybe try saying this, maybe try saying that, but it's still just kind of scratching the surface. Is you kind of have to assume that if your interface is a, an empty box, most people are not going to know what to say to it and are going
Mhm.
to want some like structure around what happens the first couple times they talk to it, and how that sort of conversation emerges. Um,
Yeah.
it's the people do not. It is a weird way to interact with the world after so many years of being given essentially a menu of things, right? Being given a menu that, for the most part, has a deterministic outcome whenever you click on it. Now to go differently and be like, hey, you don't need any of those buttons anymore. It's just like a text field. Tell it what
Yeah.
you want. That's really hard, actually. You're asking
Yeah.
the customer to take on a lot more cognitive load. Um, and structure their thinking in a way that like perhaps they never have when like dealing with an interface.
Yeah. Actually, I'd heard a podcast interview with Perplexity's CEO,
Hmm.
and there's something about this thing, even with like this whole language models, is that we have a certain way of saying a sentence, right? Like there's a construct to the sentence, like subject, object, whatever, verb, the grammar, and it's like if I have my mom talk to it, and sometimes you might not like, you might say the object thing first, or like you might just like say it in a totally different way that is not normal English, and can your language model still catch that and just figure out, yes, this is what you wanted to ask, let me give you the right answer? And I think I mean, it can do a lot of it, but there's still more work to be done. And I think that is what he was touching upon, which is what you're saying, is we don't know what the user is going to say, but can we become like that? Can that system be as smart to figure it out without having the user do extra work? So that's really fascinating. In terms of like a lot of these new technologies, like we want them to we want them to adapt to us and not the other way around.
Yeah,
So we have to see how that goes. I know we have been sort of having this conversation. There's a lot of things to talk about. I did want to like touch upon, a few more minutes on
sure.
another term that has been, again, like just like Gen AI became so, a popular, this term called founder mode went very viral a few months back. So again, what does that mean to you? And when you are working either, or you have worked in different companies, or you're consulting with somebody, like, uh, what traits do you look for in founders or leaders for companies that you work with or invest in, say, for example?
So the thing that is most interesting to me now about who I want to work with is I mostly want to work for companies or with companies where I find either the problem or the problem space like personally fascinating and interesting, right? And so that's led to some ventures in the music world, right? Because I've obviously got that as a big hobby. Obviously, it led to Zwift in the fitness world, uh, and it's kind of not enough for me anymore to work on things that like I understand are useful for some people, but that I don't necessarily want to like use every day. I actually got one very specific example. Is I got an opportunity last year to go be the general manager of a game, and I really didn't like the game, and I couldn't see myself opening it up every day and like playing it and having that be like the thing that I did. And so if every app is a game, like I really want to work on games that I like to play. When it comes to founder mode, I think is an interesting like general statement. And I've read the article from Brian Chesky or the interview or wherever it was where he was talking about it, and like I see where he's coming from, right? Like to have this thing that was his uh, full focus and sort of child, or if you will, and then be told to hire a bunch of other people to run it, and then to be pretty unhappy with how those people ran it. Like I would come to the same conclusions as him, which is like, hey, you can't step back. You need to be in there every day. It's your thing. You care the most. And so when I've looked for founders to work with, I've looked for people who I felt, had that same kind of like zeal for the thing that they were building. And it has not been that hard, actually, to find those people, right? Because I think they find that a lot earlier stage. And that's where I've been kind of working, is you find these folks who are like, it's either a problem they have that they're like rabid about solving, or it's a space that they see the opportunity in because they're a user themselves and they really want to kind of like make it work for themselves and others. I think all that is super powerful. It was true with Zwift too, by the way, right? Like a bunch of the founders are still there. They're all cyclists, right? In fact, the guy that built it for himself as a training tool, and then sort of like, decided to join forces with some other folks to turn it into a business. But he originally built Zwift because he needed a way to train indoors, because he was a new dad and couldn't justify heading out on the bike for like 3 hours on the weekends anymore. I think that, the interesting part about like, there's some extensions to it, or at least the way I saw some of it got interpreted was like, hey, get rid of all your managers, right? Like you need to have control over everything. At a certain scale, I actually kind of agree with that, right? Like I think that if you're a relatively small company and you're the founder, like you kind of should have your fingers in all of this stuff. At the very least, if you're at a small scale and you're the founder and you're outsourcing a bunch of those questions or a bunch of those decisions, I have some questions, right? I have some questions about like, why you're doing that. I think as the companies get bigger and bigger and bigger, like, I don't know, we haven't quite found the mechanisms yet, I think, where, you can be the leader of a, multi-thousand or 10,000 person company and still be like getting granularity on every decision you want. At some point, I think you have to choose what things to delegate, but I don't know. It's probably always a good idea to say, hey, am I delegating too much, right? Like, am I, am I giving myself the opportunities that I want to kind of like make the decisions I think are important in real time? And then also, are you teaching the people around you your thought processes, right? Are you training them to some degree on being able to say, oh, well, I think so-and-so would see it this way, and so that's the way we're going to do it. It's funny because we would often, at Meta, I remember that there was like a theme that went by for a while, is that we had to stop doing things just because someone said so, right?
Mhm.
Which is true, right? It came from the right spot, but like it also meant that I actually think the real answer is we needed to understand why the person said that, right? We needed to understand what it was around their thought process that led them to the decision that they wanted this thing, so we could sort of accurately represent it to our teams, and, in a way that made them feel also bought in, right? Also, like they can see how the logic had kind of come to the same decision.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. And in fact, like when you were also saying, like I met with everybody when I joined Zwift, and that also goes to show, like it's not just about like, oh, me being up here, but really I want to understand what's going on in the depths of the teams and how work is being done. And so, as a founder, having folks like that as well, who can be an extension of yourself,
Mhm.
can then be helpful, right? I mean, then it's not just delegation, but then you're really trying to, I guess, multiply yourself in some way, because you literally cannot do everything all the time when you grow. But that's really great, great way to put it. I could continue on and on asking a bunch of more questions to you, uh, but I'll try and like wrap this up. Just looking to the future, what trends or opportunities are you most excited about, and how do you see them shaping the future of the tech industry?
So the thing that I have not tried yet that I'm actually really excited about is, it's funny, one of the things that I have not done in years is like opened up a coding environment and tried to like build something on my own, right? But I, for a while I did that. I was an engineer, and even when I was a designer, I was like a design prototyper. Um, and the reason I haven't done it is in part because I was never particularly gifted at it, right? And so it always felt like a real struggle to get anything close. One of the things that I, with these new tools, right, with like new support structures in place for this stuff, is I'm really excited at some point this year to like dig back in, and I was going to make my own game. I was going to work with my son as part of his
Mhm.
homeschooling, and we're going to like concept a game and see if we can build it ourselves between the two of
Oh.
us. Uh, and it's really exciting because I can tell you for sure 5 years ago that would have been too big a lift for me, for us, right? Like I've never been a good enough engineer where I feel like I could start from scratch, right? It would be a year of ramp up. But like now I kind of feel like we might get there, right? Like we might actually be able to kickstart it off and sort of see how far we can get, using these tools. So I'm excited about that. I'm excited about better tooling. I'm excited about like, uh, I do think there could be, or there should be at some point, a way to get like closer to customers with a bunch of this stuff, right? Like, and even if you're not directly talking to them every day, like the tools to summarize and kind of figure out what large amounts of relatively unstructured data are telling you should in theory get better and better.
Mhm.
And I, as someone who used to comb through Amazon reviews for my product and just try to like literally write down like how many people said this, how many people said that, um, I'm looking forward to kind of getting that intelligence and getting that insight at scale. I think that'll be super useful.
Yeah, definitely. Um, what advice would you give to others aspiring to follow your footsteps?
Oh, don't follow my footsteps. Uh, yeah, my footsteps are weird. The advice I would give actually is like, it's really important to figure out like what you want out of your career slash job, which is something I have kind of only recently been able to figure out. But this is one thing that is not mine. It came from the coaching program I was doing. Is when every student started, I would meet with them, and we would basically take them through a list of like 8 things, and we would ask them to do this exercise where they would get $100 and they would have to put dollars in different sections, and they were real basic things, right? It was stuff like predictable compensation, right? Unpredictable compensation, like career growth and advancement, your manager, like work-life balance. And we would make people go through the exercise. And it was really funny because based on what your answers were, you could be looking at, we would have markedly different strategies for folks, right? I would get some people in who would just like have all their money in predictable compensation. And I'd be like, okay, well, your strategy is relatively straightforward because we're going to look for a broad spread of jobs at a good level, at companies paying as much as possible because that's what you're after, right? And then some folks would come in and just like not care about that at all and would really care a lot about either like specific missions that they were interested in, or like or they cared a lot about manager, right? They really just wanted a good manager. And for that, like that process is really different. Like you don't necessarily want to go into a big tech recruiting process if those are the things you care about. Like you may end up with a good manager and you may end up with the right mission, but like you may not. And you may need to be a lot more targeted around sort of how you go and do your search. So anyone who's interested, in anything that I've been doing around career, like that would be step one, is figure out what really matters to you, and then assume that that's going to change what you do, and that what matters to you is probably going to change over time, right? So even if you've done it 5 years ago, maybe time to do it again. Certainly, what I care about now, drastically different from 2020. Right. And that was drastically different from 2015. Like all the assumptions change.
Yeah. So true. So true. So speaking of $100, if I were to give you $100 and divide it between strategy, execution, and leadership for a company, how would you divide that up?
I don't understand the question. For what?
So I talk a lot about strategy and execution and
Yeah.
leadership, those three aspects being important for any company.
Mhm.
If you were to sort of prioritize in some way with those $100 across those three things,
Ooh, that's
how
hard.
would you do that?
I think you have to. I think I'd put 40 in leadership. I'd put 40 in execution, and I'd put 20 in strategy. And I might even put a little bit. I might even put a little less in strategy. I think you need to have strong leaders, and you need to have people who can kind of hold a singular vision. And I think you need to have a team and a set of processes that let you execute. And I think there are many different ways to figure out how to set your strategy to then execute against it. I also think you can have all the strategy in the world, and like if you can't execute it and don't know sort of how to lead, it kind of doesn't matter. And so I would much rather be with people that I was inspired by every day and a team that could kind of get stuff done, and assume that like with enough repetition, we'll figure out the right thing to do.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. This was a wonderful conversation. I enjoyed every bit of it. And so thank you so much for giving us your time and coming by and sharing all those thoughts with us.
Sounds great. Thank you, Priyanka. Always wonderful to see you. This was super fun. We should do it again in 6 months to a year. And I can give you entirely different answers to the same questions, I'm sure, as everything changes.
We will do that. Yes. Okay. Well, thank you so much. And see you everyone in another episode.
All right.
If today's conversation sparked new ideas or challenged your perspective, I'd love to hear from you. I work with tech leaders and founders to tackle complex challenges, whether it's scaling teams, making high-stakes decisions, or turning ambitious ideas into reality. If that sounds like something you are navigating, let's connect. Reach out via my website, thepriyankashinde.com, or find me on LinkedIn.